my grandmother, actually, she had been experiencing homelessness and mental illness, and we didn't know if she had made it out or not. I remember looking at the news footage and looking to see if I could find her in the crowd. So it was really an emotional time.
Hi, welcome to What the Earth. I'm Savannah Oviedo, and I'm here with Dr. Adelle Thomas, NRDC's Senior Director of Climate Adaptation. And we're here to talk about the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. Welcome, Adelle.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. 20 years feels like such a long time, but at the same time, with Hurricane Katrina, it's right in the forefront of a lot of people's minds. But can you take us back to 2005 and what we saw in the aftermath and during the storm?
Yeah, I think Hurricane Katrina is so impactful for people because I think it was so hard to believe that something like this was happening in the United States. It was the most destructive storm in U.S. history. Over 1,800 people died. The flooding was catastrophic. The levees failed. About 80% of New Orleans was underwater at one point. Entire neighborhoods were underwater. The majority of people that died were Black and brown people. It was also the costliest hurricane. It was about $100 billion in 2005, which is about double that today in today's dollars. So it was extremely expensive. It was just horrific seeing the images of people, on roofs, bodies bloated and floating in water, babies dehydrated and crying. Just the images, I think, stuck with people and, made it such a thing that, we didn't want to repeat or see again.
Yeah, definitely. It feels like one of those disasters where everyone remembers where they were when it happened, and a lot of people have personal experiences. I was really, really young during Katrina. I was 6 years old, but I still remember seeing those images on the news. I remember packing aid kits in Philadelphia to be sent down to Mississippi and Louisiana. I was wondering about your personal experience and if you'd be willing to share.
Yeah, so Katrina is actually really personal for me. My father was from New Orleans, so I grew up between New Orleans and the Bahamas. And Katrina actually formed in the waters of the Bahamas. It grew to hurricane strength, and then it landed in South Florida. And I was living in South Florida at the time, and I actually experienced the effects of Katrina in South Florida in the Miami area. So we had, lots of flooding, the power went out, but it was, not a big deal. And then Katrina moved on from South Florida over the Gulf and towards New Orleans. And that's where things, really got bad. I had family there that were luckily able to evacuate before the storm. But I had other family members that we had lost touch with, and we didn't know if they had made it out. So my grandmother, actually, she had been experiencing homelessness and mental illness, and we didn't know if she had made it out or not. I remember looking at the news footage and looking to see if I could find her in the crowd. So it was really an emotional time. We actually didn't hear from her until years after Katrina, when she showed up in another state. And so that's when we knew that she was okay. So it was really years of not knowing if she was alive or not. So it was a really emotional time. I remember visiting New Orleans after Katrina, driving through neighborhoods and seeing the spray paint on the front of homes with how many bodies were found inside. Just a devastation throughout the entire city that lasted for months and years afterwards. So Katrina was really personal for me. It had a really deep impact on me. It's one of the motivations for me working and focusing on climate adaptation and really centering the needs of the most vulnerable in my work.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, it's so important to hear these stories and to remember the people that were affected by Katrina and understand, right? We can talk about it being the costliest disaster, but it affected so many people so viscerally. So I really appreciate you sharing that. I also want to get into learning more about your work in climate adaptation. I mean, like you've said, it's no coincidence that you followed this path in your professional career. And I'd love to know this path that you've taken and how your experience has influenced that.
Yeah, so I've focused my career on climate adaptation and helping people to prepare for the impacts of climate change. When I first started out, we would talk about climate change impacts not happening until the year 2100. And now here we are in 2025, and they're right here affecting people. My work has been largely in the international space, where I've helped developing countries in particular to figure out how they're going to deal with climate change. I've been really involved in the UN system, working on the science policy interface of how is it that we have evidence-based decisions about how do we deal with climate change. And I'm really happy to be at NRDC now, looking more domestically in the US as to how do we deal with these issues here at home, and how do we make the connections to the rest of the world.
Yeah, definitely. That work is so important. And talking about climate adaptation is so key when we talk about Katrina and we look back at it, because I think there was such a large failure on many levels and in many different factors. Can we go more into that? Because it wasn't even the strongest or the biggest storm to hit the US, but it caused such devastation. What were these factors at play? Where was the climate adaptation working and where wasn't it? And what have we learned since then?
Yeah. So back then in 2005, we were not talking too much about climate adaptation. It was more about like disaster management. And Katrina was the perfect example of disaster management gone terribly, terribly wrong. It started with the preparation. So even the evacuation orders that didn't come until hours before the storm, there was this miscommunication and lack of responsibility between the federal government, state and local. Even the president was involved, and everyone playing this blame game as to who was at fault for not issuing the evacuation orders. But the fact is that they were not issued in time. There were no provisions for people that didn't have the resources to evacuate, to get out of town. So people, that were low income, that didn't have a car, like it's expensive to evacuate. If you're living week to week or month to month, you don't have just some money available to pick up and leave and to pay to live somewhere else for who knows how long. So lots of people were left in the city of New Orleans to really face the storm on their own. People, were directed to go to the Superdome as a shelter of last resort, which was extremely unprepared. Not enough food, not enough water, not enough security, sexual assaults, people dying in the Superdome and people just being stuck in there. It was horrific. So I think, the preparedness was really inhumane and caused a lot of the destruction.
Yeah, and I think with any disaster, hindsight's 2020, but it feels really strange to say that knowing that there were such real consequences to not being prepared, even if it's helped us learn now and informed us on, better adaptation strategies. Understanding that certain things could have been avoided back then is something really hard to reckon with, and something I think the US has had to reckon with. Another big critical moment in Katrina was FEMA and their response, and people not understanding FEMA's role in general. And the way that FEMA was operating in 2005, I think, is very different than how they operate now. So back in 2005, what were we seeing with the FEMA response? I think you've already touched on it with the miscommunication, with the blame game. But what was happening then that maybe they've improved now? Or is there a difference at all?
Yeah, I think the FEMA response to Katrina really showed how unprepared the agency was for an event of that size. FEMA took days to show up after the storm. People were left to their own devices in New Orleans without any assistance. People didn't have food, they didn't have water, there was no electricity. And that's where we saw a lot of breakdown. And then there were talks about looting happening and talks about, people having to rely on community members and not the government. So if you look at some of the documentaries that are done, you'll see lots of people that are saying you cannot rely on the government. I'll never rely on the government again. And I think that was due to the failure of FEMA to show up right after the storm when people needed help. They were late. When they did come, they were disorganized. It took days to evacuate people from the Superdome. It took days for them to rescue people that were stranded on the roofs of their homes. People died waiting for FEMA. And so FEMA got a really bad rep, as I think that they should have. They also brought in, armed military to deal with people that had just gone through this incredibly traumatic experience. It was just a really botched and horrific response. And it just really showed that the way that FEMA was going about disaster recovery was not up to par at all.
Yeah, it just, I think, created so much distrust in people. And it's so valid of them to feel that way. But I also feel like, as someone who was younger when that happened, and now understanding how FEMA responds and works in communities to respond to disasters, to help prepare for them, and then in the aftermath provide any type of aid or support. When did we start to see this change in FEMA? Was that from Katrina and understanding how badly they failed, the American people?
Yeah, I think Katrina was a major wake-up call for FEMA. The following year, they went through major reforms where they really clarified what their role was and what their responsibilities were. They, improved their logistics to be able to help people, much sooner than they did with Katrina. They had a new focus on local partnerships involving local communities, community organizations in the response and recovery efforts, really recognizing the value that people there on the ground bring to immediate response. They really then started focusing on pre-disaster planning and resilience, so helping communities, to make themselves less vulnerable before a disaster happens. So not just focusing on coming in after a disaster, but what is it that we can do beforehand to make people less at risk, which I think is super important, and ties in with the climate adaptation. They also improved their technology and communication. So they had, new ways to model risk, new flood maps to show places that would be vulnerable, using social media to be in touch with people, like meeting people where they are. Mm-hmm. So they did really make a lot of improvements that were spurred by Katrina.
Right. And I feel like that can't be understated at all, and the trust that they've tried to rebuild in the American public. And it's 20 years later, we've seen this growth and this improvement in FEMA, and we understand FEMA to be an agency that's there to aid us in times of disasters that we are seeing occur more frequently. And you would think, right, 20 years later, let's keep that momentum going. But what we're seeing is the opposite. And the current administration is setting us back almost to a time pre-Katrina. It feels that, the administration and the current president is suggesting that these disasters should largely be responded to by state and local governments, which is what we were doing during Katrina and what failed so largely at that time. So what are these rollbacks and these attacks we're seeing on this agency, and what is the implication of that?
Yeah. So before we get into the attacks on FEMA and how this administration is rolling back, I think we also need to realize that FEMA was just one part of the problem with Katrina. Mm-hmm. Like, there were also these really deep structural and systemic issues that led to the populations that we saw being most affected. So, New Orleans has a history of racial segregation where Black people, through, decades and centuries of segregation, were located in places that were low-lying at high risk of flooding. And so that's why we saw, the disproportionate impacts on Black communities. There was also, New Orleans had a really high poverty rate, and we can get into all of the inequalities that lead to poverty. And this is why, poor people were there and couldn't evacuate. So I think those structural and systemic, issues are also underpinning what happened with Katrina in addition to FEMA. And so 20 years later, we're seeing a reality that puts us behind where we were at before. This administration's attacks on FEMA, I think, are horrendous. Questioning even the need to have FEMA, questioning the need to have federal support, which is so clearly needed. This administration has made severe cuts to the employees and expertise at FEMA. About a third of the full-time employees have been either fired or have resigned, and that's critical expertise that's needed. Even the leadership doesn't have that disaster management experience that they need. And so, just the personnel that's needed to deal with these disasters is being cut.
Right. And these FEMA cuts aren't happening in a silo. This is not the first agency to experience rollbacks or, under this administration. One of the first things, I think you bringing up these structural and systemic issues that the administration rolled back was DEI efforts.
So, yeah, you're right. It's not just the attacks on FEMA. And we could get into like all of the different attacks that are being made on FEMA that makes it so much less able to do its job. It is also the attacks on DEI, not just within the federal government, but on universities and private sector and NGOs, like trying to erase the decades of knowledge that we've built up around the need to address systemic racism, to address issues that place certain people more at risk than others. And ignoring that is only going to make people more vulnerable and more at risk. There's also the attacks on science, so cuts at NOAA and cuts at the National Weather Service, which are going to make it harder to forecast these storms. It's going to make it harder to figure out who needs to evacuate and where they should evacuate. And that's putting more and more people at risk. There are the cuts to the social safety net. So billions of dollars of cuts to Medicaid and to food assistance. That's affecting low-income people and making them more at risk to disaster, but more at risk into falling deeper into poverty. You don't want to provide money for poor children to have food to eat. It's like, what type of society are we living in? It's attacks on immigrants. Immigrants are, valid and valuable members of our society. Attacking them and, going after immigrants means that when a disaster or when an extreme event comes through, they're not going to want to seek safety and seek shelter. And we'll see increasing, impacts on these communities. And immigrant communities are so important in our recovery process. They're normally leading the way in recovering and rebuilding. There's also, I think, more broadly, this administration's denial of climate change. Ramping up investments in fossil fuel emissions. And that is just going to make these storms and extreme events in general so much more worse. So we're making the problem worse while reducing the tools that we have to deal with the problem, which is going to make impacts on people, and in particular, poor people, people of color, immigrants, even worse. So, you look at the documentaries, the footage of Katrina, it seems like so long ago. It seems so old. And you think that couldn't happen today. But the reality is we are in a much worse position than we were 20 years ago. And if a storm like Hurricane Katrina were to come now, we may see the same or worse impacts than we saw then.
It feels almost dystopian in its reality. And I think there can be a lot of hope lost there. And it's tough to hear all of this news and be concerned about, am I prepared if a disaster hits? Is my family prepared? Are these communities that are on the front line of the climate crisis prepared? People in poverty, often marginalized communities, people of color. Do we have hope? Do we have actions that we can take to fight these cuts that are happening from the Trump administration, these attacks that are happening and leaving people vulnerable? Is there anything we can do about it, or do we just have to watch the news and hope that we have more time left?
Yeah. I mean, it is a really dark time, and it does feel heavy and a lot. And even myself, there are days when I just want to disengage and disconnect and just scroll TikTok and try and pretend as if things aren't happening. But that's not going to help us. Disengagement is not going to help this. We need people to engage, to learn about what's happening federally, what's happening in their city, what's happening in their communities. How are these policies affecting you? Educate yourself, talk to people around you, figure out how your voice can be heard. Voting is one way to make your voice be heard. You can join, different organizations that are doing things. NRDC is one of the organizations where we're doing a lot of work to fight back against these injustices. I think what gives me hope is knowing the work that I do every day is helping to fight this problem. And the adaptation team here at NRDC, we're fighting to make sure that FEMA is still around. We're helping states to improve their resilience so that they're not at risk for future disasters. We're fighting to make sure that workers that have to deal with extreme heat have some protections. So the work that we're doing here at NRDC is really giving me hope in that there are organizations, there are people who care very passionately about these issues and are actively working on, policies and action that can help to combat the destruction that we've seen.
Right. I feel very fortunate to work here because with this influx of all this terrible news, I get to work with people who are actively fighting to protect us from that. And I think it all ties back to when we look at disasters, they always tell us, look for the helpers. And there's so many helpers across, in the agencies. They're still there, holding strong, still doing the good work that needs to be done, even if maybe those in positions of power are climate deniers or are the ones, that are actively working against them. I think we need to just remember to look for the helpers. Did you want to go a little bit more into some of the work that we're doing?
Yeah. So one of the things that we've done for FEMA in particular was submit really detailed comments to FEMA as to how the current administration's actions are crippling FEMA and how that's going to result in greater vulnerabilities and risks for communities that are most at risk. So we submitted them along with thousands of other comments. We did an analysis of all of the comments. The vast majority of them were in support of keeping FEMA. FEMA isn't perfect. There are some things that need to improve, but by no means should it be cut down. By no means should we leave states to try and figure this out on their own. We've seen what happens with that, and it's not good for anyone. So that's some of the work that we're actively doing there. We're also, trying to help people that have been affected by disaster repeatedly or who have been flooded repeatedly, and helping to make sure that there are policies and funding in place that allow them to move out of harm's way, to be able to sell their property and have enough money to go somewhere where it's more safe. So those are sort of some of the real, tangible things that we're doing. I'm a really strong believer in action and doing things that make a difference. You can have your thought pieces and all of that, but what is it that you're actually doing on the ground to make sure that we have a real impact? And that's what we're focusing on.
Yeah, that's so inspiring. I actually have a comment here from the public comment drive. It was an anonymous comment from someone who was a former resident of Louisiana and lived through Hurricane Katrina. They say that, like many others, we lived in a FEMA trailer in the front yard for months, slowly rebuilding our lives in the shadow of uncertainty. That experience taught me firsthand how critical FEMA is in turning despair into recovery, and how its presence, coordination, and resources can mean the difference between displacement and survival. The agency's support was not just logistical, it was symbolic. It represented the federal government's promise that no community would be left behind. And I think the way they end this comment is really the most powerful of, the next storm is not a matter of if, but when. FEMA's role in ensuring that recovery is swift, inclusive, and resilient cannot be overstated. My story is just one of thousands, but it is a reminder that behind every policy, there are families, neighborhoods, and futures at stake. I feel like this really sums up what you've been talking about and highlighting the stories of survivors and victims of Katrina, of the people that were failed during that, and how we can use these 20 years behind us to keep getting better, but continuing that improvement and that growth. So I really appreciate you having you on and being willing to talk and for this conversation.
Thanks so much, Savannah. This was great. And I hope we learn from our past 20 years and what we're going through now to come out better on the other side.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Thanks.